Welcome to Channel's Business Global with me, Juliana Olayinka, from our studios here in London. Over the next half hour, we'll be looking beyond the business headlines by giving you in-depth perspective on the stories that are affecting all of us. Coming up on today's show, Brexit. In this crucial make or break 24 hours for the British government to try and secure an EU exit, we'll be giving you the latest views from Europe, the legal world, and voices from the diaspora. Before those discussions, here's our business correspondent Simon Pusey, who joins me for a breakdown of this week's headline-grabbing stories.
Yeah, Facebook's Libra cryptocurrency has had more bad news. The project must not go ahead until the firm proves it is safe and secure. That's according to a report by the G7 group of countries. The world's biggest economies warned cryptocurrencies such as Libra pose a risk to the global financial system. The draft report outlines 9 major risks posed by such digital currencies. It warns that even if Libra's backers address concerns, the project may not get approval from regulators. That comes just days after payments giants MasterCard and Visa pulled out of the Libra project, citing regulatory uncertainty. Well, moving to China, where the telecoms company Huawei say that in the third quarter of 2019, its revenue increased by nearly 25%, while its net profit margin in that period grew to 8.7%. The Chinese business said it had maintained its focus on ICT infrastructure and smart devices and continued to boost the efficiency and quality of its operations. Many see this as an impressive feat, particularly as the US and Australia have banned their networks from using Huawei's equipment. They and many other countries, including the UK, are fearful of the company's close ties to the Chinese government and worry the company could be used to spy on or monitor people. However, Germany says it will not exclude the tech giant from its 5G mobile networks, saying it wants to create a level playing field for vendors. Meanwhile, the UK has promised a decision this autumn on whether the equipment maker should be excluded from its 5G rollout. And finally, here in the UK, Royal Mail is facing its first national postal strike in a decade after staff voted overwhelmingly for action. The dispute between workers and the firm is over job security and terms and conditions of employment. More than 97% of votes by members of the Communication Workers Union backed a strike, with a turnout rate of 76%. Strike dates have yet to be announced, but the union could target the annual Black Friday retail sales event in late November and the Christmas post, which is obviously the busiest time of the year. The CWU says an agreement reached with management last year to raise pay and reform pensions has not been honoured. About 110,000 members of the union were balloted in the dispute.
As always, thank you, Simon. Here's some other business news from across the globe. Hyundai Motor Group said it plans to invest $35 billion in mobility technology by 2025. This is part of a South Korea government-backed initiative to become more competitive in self-driving cars. Earlier this year, the automaker and 2 of its affiliates announced an investment of $1.6 billion in a venture with US self-driving tech firm Aptiv. Cuba has announced plans to allow some stores to sell domestic appliances and other goods in US dollars. This comes as the country struggles to get to grips with the black market. Cuba's state-run economy is facing a crisis due to the tightening of decades-old US trade embargo under President Donald Trump. Possession of the dollar and other tradable currencies is legal, but they have previously not been deemed legal tender for purchases. Britain's Duke and Duchess of Cambridge met with Pakistan's Prime Minister Arif Alvi earlier this week during a 5-day high-security visit to the country. It comes as Britain seeks to reinvigorate its foreign relations with the looming deadline for its departure from the EU. Pakistan is also working to repair its global image to boost tourism and investment. South Africa's former president Jacob Zuma will appeal last week's High Court decision to deny him a permanent stay of prosecution relating to a $2 billion arms deal. The former leader faces charges of fraud, racketeering and money laundering relating to a deal to buy European military hardware for South Africa's armed forces in the 1990s. Now over to our main topic, Brexit. Now that Britain have clinched a last-minute deal with the European Union, Prime Minister Boris Johnson's government is still scrambling to get their withdrawal agreement ratified by members of the House of Commons. Officials in the complex divorce between the world's 5th largest economy and its biggest trading bloc say that even though an endgame appears to be in sight, the country is still intractably divided between Leavers and Remainers and opposition parties.
It's a reasonable, fair outcome and reflects the large amount of work that's been undertaken by both sides. And I agree very much, Jean-Claude, with what you said about protecting the peace process in the island of Ireland and in Northern Ireland. And, of course, for us in the UK, it means that we can deliver a real Brexit that achieves our objectives.
We have a deal. And this deal means that there is no need for any kind of prolongation. This is a fair, a balanced agreement. It is testament to our commitment to finding solutions. It provides certainty where Brexit creates uncertainty. It protects the rights of our citizens, and it protects peace and stability on the island of Ireland.
Now, for a continental perspective, joining me from Stockholm via Skype is Glenn Hodgson, the founder and CEO of Free Trade Europa, a think tank focused on European policy. The EU summit will continue today. You're on the continent. I know not part of the European Union, but what is the sentiment on the continent at the moment? Are they as fed up with Brexit as we are here?
100%. Yes, it's one of those things that drags on month after month, year after year. And there really is a incoming fatigue here that really just to get something done. The patience of the European Commission, but also French and German leaders, but also traditional allies. The Swedes, Dutch, the Danes are also running out of patience and are really sick to the back teeth of Brexit and the ongoing discussion.
I must say, you mentioned the leaders. The most important leaders at the moment, I would say, of course, are German Chancellor Angela Merkel, French President Emmanuel Macron, and, of course, Leo Varadkar, purely because the island of Ireland is the sticking point. But there are some suggestions that maybe even the French president would veto an extension. Do you think that is likely, that it wouldn't be Boris Johnson not asking for the extension, that the EU may just put their hands and say, this is as far as we've come?
Yeah, and I think that in private, there's a lot of exasperation and those kind of feelings. The reality is that the European Commission and also other European member states would not be seen to be the ones pushing the UK out of the door. They want to basically say that, we've done everything that we can. We're facilitating this process, we understand it, and basically give Boris Johnson and the UK enough rope to hang themselves with. There will never be a case whereby they will be seen to have blood on their hands and be the ones who have pushed the UK out of the European Union.
Of course, I think Boris Johnson, the British Prime Minister, he's saying if there isn't a deal, it's a failure of statesmanship, and he's trying to drag everybody in with him. Let me ask you very lastly, Glenn, what do the Europeans think of Boris Johnson? Because, of course, he's decidedly different from Theresa May. He has said from the beginning his mandate was to leave on the 31st, do or die. Do they respect that?
I think there's a certain element of ghoulish respect for Boris Johnson, that he actually says something and seems to want to push it through, which has been, all the flip-flopping for sort of months and years beforehand. I think to at least have something to aim for is kind of refreshing. Boris Johnson is such a chameleon in terms of, what he wants. First of all, this sort of new liberal coming to sort of hardline Brexiteer. So people don't really know where they have him, but I think the reality is that they'd like to have something done now, and also a quirkish charm that love him or hate him, you cannot play down the fact that he has a certain charisma about him.
A certain charisma, and potentially the toughest job on the planet at the moment. Glenn Hodgson, the CEO of Free Trade Europa, a think tank, thank you very much for joining us on Channel's Business Global. Joining me in the studio to help flesh this out even further is Obi Wakeji, a solicitor and founder of OGN Solicitors. Obi, tomorrow the Commons will meet. This is the first time that they've met on a Saturday since the start of the Falklands War. Boris Johnson has until 11 p.m. to get a Brexit deal or ask for an extension. What are your predictions on what's going to happen this weekend?
Well, my predictions are either way it goes, he's definitely going to have to ask for an extension. The reasons are that France and Germany have already indicated that irrespective of whether a deal was reached or not, they'll have to look into the technical details of it. So it'll take a long time, they're saying months.
But we know that. You can potentially have a deal without the technical details written out and still leave, surely.
Well, because it's an international treaty, it's a very complex document. They're reluctant to agree to all those terms within that period of time. So they're saying, that's fine, we agree to this, but we will still need time to look over it, to look at the details, to make sure that it's, it addresses all the points and topics and issues that we are concerned about. So irrespective of what happens, I do believe that Boris, the Prime Minister, I should say, will ask for that extension. That's my prediction, definitely.
Well, it's interesting you say he'll ask for an extension. We know he's legally bound to. Of course, we're neither here nor there. You probably are more than me anyway, about whether or not there is a loophole within it. But can you just explain some of the details of the Benn Act for those of us who aren't legal practitioners?
OK, well, what the Benn Act essentially provides is that if the Prime Minister is unable to secure a deal, to avoid the UK leaving the European Union without a deal, he has to, by law, go to the European Union and ask for an extension of time. Till at least January 2020. So he's bound by law to do that. Whether or not he does that, that's yet to be seen, because as I've said before, we are in uncharted waters. This is like a movie script, like I've said before. Everybody's trying to...
Unprecedented, isn't it?
It's
understatement of the year.
It is. But irrespective of that, he will definitely, I believe, have to ask for that extension. But then, if he doesn't, what happens? He will sit down and legal action will have to take course. But it's very, very likely that he will ask for that extension.
Obi, there's a lot of talk about Remainers. Of course, I know tomorrow there'll be demonstrations across the UK, particularly outside Westminster, of people saying to stop Brexit. What about the 17.4 million people who voted to leave? They won the referendum, but it seems as if their voice has been completely marginalised from the debate. What would it say about democracy if tomorrow Boris Johnson has to ask again for another extension?
Well, there'll be complete dissatisfaction with those members of the public who voted to leave. And obviously, I believe that even those people who asked to remain, who voted to remain, some of them are getting pretty much fed up. Now, even though there might be demonstrations, or there will be demonstrations tomorrow, it's quite important that Brexit is delivered in one way or the other. Because remember, if a second referendum comes to place, if another extension comes through, for example, there's another general election, as you've quite rightly put, what happens to the voices who actually voted to leave? So there has to be a point in which the UK government, the Prime Minister, is able to deliver this Brexit to, maybe not to the satisfaction of everybody, because let's face it, there were 52% of the population voted for it, 48% voted against it. So not everybody's going to be satisfied, but it has to be delivered in order to protect democracy, no matter how you think about it. And I do understand that people are annoyed about Brexit or whether it's going to take place or not. But the democratic process did take place, and it is up to the Prime Minister to try to deliver it to the best of his ability in order to protect that fundamental institution, that fundamental process and procedure, which is called democracy.
Obi Nkweji, OGN Solicitors, thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed for having me.
Coming up, more insight on the do or die Brexit countdown. See you after the break. Welcome back to Channel's Business Global with me, Juliana Olayinka, from our studios here in London. Now, before the break, we were talking about the legal and continental viewpoints on Britain's bitter divorce from its European trading partners. And now we're hearing views from the diaspora. Joining me in the studio are political analysts Lagun Akinloye and Femi Okutubo, the publisher at the Trumpet Media Group UK. Lagun, before the break, I was speaking to Obi Nkweji, and I was saying that there are 17.4 million people who won the referendum vote, who decided to leave the European Union, and it appears as if their voices are being marginalised. If tomorrow, Saturday, Commons MPs vote down a potential deal, what does this say about democracy in Britain?
I mean, democracy in Britain, I think, has come a long way. I think it is democracy that has enabled us to get to this point. A referendum was held, and yes, you are completely right that 17.5 million people voted to leave the EU. But things follow a certain process. and sadly the process has been a bit long-winded. It all takes place what Boris Johnson can extract from the EU in terms of the agreement, in terms of the Irish backstop, in terms of getting what is best for Britain. But on both sides, there are competing forces who do not want Britain to leave in the first place. The EU want to give Britain a deal that we're not happy with. We've got a situation where it's very sticky and very difficult to actually see the end game.
It is difficult, isn't it? Femi, you were on Channel's Business Global previously when we had our first discussion, our first special show about Brexit. Does it feel now that Brexit may indeed happen?
I don't think I'm really sure about that, even though there seems to have been a bit of progress over the last 72 hours. But the reality is things keep on changing. And so you never can tell what's going to happen. I think Boris Johnson is still counting on the DUP, for example, to sort of back him, especially on the issue of the Irish border and the backstop. Whether that would really be, whether the deal would be totally acceptable is something that we're all waiting to see.
We're talking about this deal, and there has been so much focus and attention on the EU, and there's been meetings, they're calling them marathon sessions that have been taking place in Brussels and Luxembourg, actually. But Theresa May got a deal. That wasn't her most difficult part. The most difficult part for Theresa May is that she couldn't get it through the Commons. Do you think that Boris Johnson's biggest battle will be the Commons? Because, of course, we saw those toxic sessions a couple of weeks ago where there were several apologies about hate crimes and just how heated it got. Do you think that the Labour, who most of them obviously don't want to support Boris Johnson, but they have to back their constituents who voted to leave?
I think that's probably the most difficult aspect of things, is that you have certain MPs who are in constituencies in which their voters, the people who put them into power, have voted to actually leave the EU. When it came to Theresa May, it seems that the deal wasn't to everyone's liking. What she brought back from the European Union wasn't something that Britain on the whole could deal with. Boris Johnson this week alone has gone to Ireland to see the Prime Minister of the Republic of Ireland. He's gone to the EU. He's gone to various different constituents in the UK, and the mood has been changing. Maybe a deal can be made. Maybe there is light at the end of the tunnel. Now, I think also the MPs are quite fed up of this whole rigmarole.
Are they? It seems as if it's the MPs that are keeping us in this situation.
They are fed up because they want him to bring back a good deal, the one that actually can be discussed.
The Liberal Democrats don't want him to bring back a good deal. They don't want a deal. They want to revoke Article 50. That's their mandate.
Liberal Democrats are in the minority of minorities. Therefore, their electoral value and their voting powers will not really dent if a deal is to actually be made. He's looking at Labour Remainers, and he's looking at consolidating and bringing together his own party, as well as the DUP.
Femi, Boris Johnson is being called the People's Prime Minister. There are some suggestions that he is literally being held hostage by MPs. You know, they don't want a general election. We know that general elections in this country and around the world should be about domestic policy. But considering we've got the Liberal Democrats that are saying, if you vote for us, we revoke Article 50, you've got the majority of Tories saying, if you vote for us, you know, it's a hard deal Brexit. And then, of course, Labour are kind of floating a second referendum. They're not going for a general election. Do you think he is kind of coming up as the People's Prime Minister?
I don't think so, because I think in the first instance, he started off on some very wrong steps, especially with what he tried to do in terms of proroguing Parliament. I think, that wasn't really a popular decision. And to also get the courts, right up to the Supreme Court to, in both London and Scotland to actually revoke that or turn that around, is not something that scored a good tick on his sheet. Now, I think the other thing as well is that he initially came across as someone who thought he could just bluff his way through, because there were a number of strategies that they tried to put in place that did not work. But at the end of the day, he only seems to have now woken up to reality. Whether his popularity is increasing with the people is another issue entirely. But I think the reality is issues have to be dealt with. And I think that is what is now being done now. Now, yes, you have different political parties that have different stances on this. But what you will find out as well is that when you even look at the people that voted some years, 3 years ago, the 17.4 million people that we're referring to, some of them believe that they were not given all the right information.
You're never given the right information. You hear that about this referendum. It's the same with an election, you know. You look through the mandate and it's completely different to what happens. And a lot of, the Leavers are not buying that. They're not all stupid as a lot of lefty Remainers are trying to claim them out to be. They know what they voted for. And in fact, there are some polls, Lagan, that are suggesting that there are some Remainers that are now saying, look, I voted to Remain, but you've got to get this process done. But I want to bring it back to the question about Boris Johnson and whether or not he is being held hostage and whether or not, considering he has asked twice for a general election and political parties are saying no, do you think that he could rise out of the ashes for this and go down in history as being at least a prime minister who wanted to follow the democratic process?
I think when Boris Johnson got into power, that it was his dream and his ambition to reach the #1 spot. There was no hidden fact that once he got there, if he was to get there, which he did, that it would be very difficult pertaining to the actual climate of politics in the UK. Things have become very divisive. The atmosphere is darkened. The general feeling of politics right now is one of doom and gloom. Therefore, it is very difficult to work within those parameters to achieve a considerable positive result. So whatever situation he's going to come into is going to be difficult to begin with. He cannot claim to be held hostage by MPs because Theresa May was held hostage. The difficulties of...
Well, Theresa May got an election, didn't she, at least?
They will not give Boris an election because they know why he's calling it. They know that if you call it now, that the Tories will win. But
if the Tories win, that means his policy and his mandate of a do or die Brexit on October the 31st is a mandate supported by the people. Let me ask this quickly, Femi. The political paralysis, that's what it's being labelled as, the state of Britain at the moment. Do you think that that is affecting the way the international community are perceiving us?
Definitely they do, because Britain has always been looked at as, the beacon of democracy, or one of the beacons of democracy around the world. And what you now have now is a situation where it's definitely a stalemate. Things are not really clear. Nobody knows what's going to happen in the next 24 hours, let alone, months or even years ahead. And obviously, if other countries are going to deal with Britain, for example, whether it's in terms of trade, business, or whatever it might be, there needs to be some degree of certainty. So that's a bit of a discouragement. But I think there is increasing confidence over the last few days that, well, we seem to be moving towards some form of solution.
Lagan, let me ask you finally, this political uncertainty, what's the reality of that? Is it all smoke and mirrors, or is there a big concern about Britain's future in the world?
The concern is real and the concern is very valid. In recent times, 1/3 of domestic car makers have shed jobs. The pound is plummeting. British people who live in Europe are scared about the visa restrictions, are scared about their livelihoods. 3 million EU nationals have applied for British citizenship over the past 6 months. People are generally concerned and confused and not in the know about what's going to happen next. Look at the investment climate. Look at even the Queen's speech the other day. That one was itself did not let you know what the inevitable outcome will be at the end of the day. So unless this confusion is brought to an end, Britain will, in my point of view, will receive a downturn in fortunes.
My goodness, a downturn in fortunes in Britain. Never would we think we'd be saying that, but I think that is the political climate of the day, isn't it? Lagan Akinloye, Femi Okutumbo, thank you very much for joining me on this special Brexit programme. Thank you. Sadly, that's all we have time for today, but do join us again at the same time next week for more in-depth business analysis on Channel's Business Global. Goodbye.